Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Alberta tar sands pipelines and the Keystone XL pipeline are invigorating the environmental movement in the U.S. and Canada. They are going up against massive TransCanada's Energy East and Texas-based pipeline giant Kinder Morgan's expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline running through Vancouver on the coast of British Columbia. On Wednesday, the Canadian Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, announced plans to bring in a climate test for pipeline projects. She said that they will be assessing the direct and upstream greenhouse gas emissions of pipeline projects and that Indigenous people will be meaningfully consulted and where appropriate, impacts on their rights and interests will be accommodated. Joining us now to discuss this is Clayton Thomas-Muller. He is a member of the Matthias Clome Cree Nation in Canada, based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Clayton is Stop It at the Source campaigner for 350.org. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So the government of Canada, Clayton, has said that they will be far more conscientious when it comes to First Nations and consult them on these pipeline projects. So do you have a reason to believe that you will be meaningfully consulted?
Well, I think it's important to delineate between what the federal government of Canada interprets as meaningful consultation and what the international standard of Indigenous peoples' rights are reflected in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The federal government of Canada has committed to a 1.5 degree international climate target at the historic Paris Climate Summit just this last December. So it leads anyone in the know on the realities of the global climate crisis. Why are we still talking about tar sands pipelines and the expansion of the Alberta tar sands if this is the international political climate commitment that Prime Minister Trudeau has made in Paris? The other commitment and election platform that the Liberal government ran on was that they committed to ratify the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which includes the right to free, prior and informed consent. In other words, the right to say no to harmful projects like Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain and like TransCanada's Energy East. There have been dozens and dozens of First Nations that have expressed concern about the legitimacy of the National Energy Board as even being the mechanism to consult, and it has forced the federal government to react and announce the revisions yesterday. But are they adequate? Absolutely not. All the Trudeau government has done is threw a new coat of paint on former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's NEB review process. They've attached timeframes, 4 months on Kinder Morgan, 9 months on Energy East, I believe, to do adequate consultation. And I don't understand how you can put a timeline on adequate consultation with dozens and dozens of frontline impacted First Nations communities in the right of way of both of these pipelines.
Now, Clayton, this government, Trudeau government, and Catherine McKenna came into leadership promising us a dramatic new era when it comes to Canada's environmental policy. And then after signing the agreement in Paris, meaningful or not, in terms of its impact, you would think that they would be more cautious about going forward with the plans of this sort. Are there any, getting back to my first question, meaningful consultation going on with the environmental movement at the moment in order to lessen the impact of the fossil fuels Canada is putting into the air?
I think that the steps this government has taken so far, have certainly struck inspiration and interest from social movement sectors concerned about climate change. But the proof, as they say, is in the pudding. It's in actions taken by the federal government to actually mitigate the global climate crisis and Canada's contribution to it. Canada's tar sands must absolutely remain in the ground according to the most recent scientific analysis. There is a shared scientific imperative globally amongst climate scientists that dirty fossil fuel energy like Canada's tar sands, 85% must remain in the ground if we're going to achieve the international climate target commitments of Paris. And I think that, you know, the announcements thus far and the actions thus far that the Trudeau government has taken, you know, certainly do not get us to where we need to go. So we're going to continue to put pressure on the federal government, you know, over their 1.5 degree climate target that they committed to in Paris, because you don't get to show up at the world's biggest climate summit and make those kinds of commitments and then return back to Canada and continue to support the expansion of one of the dirtiest fossil fuel developments on the face of the earth and its associated pipeline infrastructure. Just doesn't go together.
So, Clayton, give us a sense of what you would say to our new energy minister if you had an opportunity to talk to her and bring her to her senses in terms of what so many people in the environmental movement and just ordinary citizens are screaming out to be heard.
Well, I think that, you know, both the United States government and the Canadian government need to take much more dramatic steps in reducing the use of fossil fuel in their energy mix. You know, we need a just transition to a justice-based renewable energy economy that doesn't force Americans and Canadians to have to choose between certain communities being sacrificed at the altar of irresponsible energy and climate policy for the benefit of shareholders, you know, living thousands of kilometers away from the point of impact of these two things. And I think that, you know, for us, you know, we've seen a steady increase in the expansion of the climate justice movement. And as you can see here in Canada, it's having a dramatic impact on policymakers in Ottawa. And they are responding to pressure coming from social movements concerned about the expansion of the tar sands and concerned about, you know, the fact that we're still debating whether or not infrastructure that'll hardwire our economy into the fossil fuel regime for the next century should be built or not. You know, these debates are over. We've passed the era of climate denial, and certainly policymakers in the Beltway there in the United States and here on the Hill in Ottawa's Parliament should take heed.
All right, Clayton, I thank you so much for joining us today, and we wish you all the best in your fight back.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.